After all, the survivors recognized the humanity in their assailants. After all, Amory himself was the one who at least imagined, right, his torturers undoing the deed so that they, Germans, can re-enter history. But then again, survivors adamantly rail against the commission of crimes. And in fact, survivors never mention the word forgiveness, except to reject it. And we do find in testimonies lots of references to forgiveness, but with the intention to reject the word as an option of negotiating these difficult paths. Simon Wiesenthal, for example, said that he could not forgive Karl because to do so would, in his words, finish with and dispose of the painful business. Or Primo Levi, an important witness, had written, "I am not inclined to forgive because I know of no act that can erase a crime." These kind of remarks, and as I say, there are many of those who therefore commented precisely in these very terms, were common in the 1960s, when, incidentally, many survivors for the first time elected to write about their experiences during the Nazi era. In the 1960s, there existed an international debate over the enforcement of statutory limitations that would have released Nazi criminals from further prosecution. There was considerable pressure, public pressure, on survivors to move on or to no longer dwell on this past. Survivors who were inspired by this debate to therefore go on record about this past, to prove to the world that this is a deep and unprecedented experience that shouldn't follow the usual rules of statutory limitations. And they moreover insisted that it would be impossible for them to forgive and forget. This is important in the way the survivors were therefore dealing with, right, this kind of pressure on them to forgive. Because they couple the word forgive and forget. It's a common enough phrase. You and I, right, would automatically make a relationship between the two. If you're asking me to forgive, I'm assuming you're also suggesting that I forget the offense. Moving on. But what would happen if forgiveness did not mean to forget? What, on the contrary, would happen if forgiveness were strong and demanded memory? What, in other words, would it look like if we were to forgive and remember? Now, these are the kinds of questions that, in fact, were generated by this very debate, and were explored by such folks as Vladimir Yankelevich, who was Polish but resided in France during the war, and Jacques Derrida. Since this debate, other thinkers, scholars, have become involved in this question of really what is forgiveness and what are its assumptions? What do we expect from that? Philosopher Paul Ricoeur drew the conclusion that acts of forgiveness must extract the agent from the act, which is to say, to separate the criminal from the crime. theorists, also French incidentally, Julia Kristeva, also argued for what Ricoeur called a radical uncoupling. I like the phrase. She wrote that the victim can forgive the murderer, but not the murderer. That's the radical uncoupling. And so in this light, we must therefore ask the question, do survivors suggest a desire to forgive, a disposition to forgive, something they could not articulate if it meant to forget, which is what it meant to survivors, certainly in the 1960s, and basically what it means to you and me. When Wiesenthal recognizes in Karl this more complete personality, he's not excusing his criminal deeds. On the contrary, he recalls, he bears witness to them. Does he then forgive Karl the murderer, if not his murder? Does Amory contradict himself when on the one hand he valorizes his retroactive rancor, and on the other imagines a human in German fellowship? In fact, Amory, like Wiesenthal, is doing both in these narratives. They are, in fact, seeking to imagine another relationship with these offenders. For Amory, a German nobility, a German spiritual nobility. And in so seeking, I'm going to suggest, is reaching out to forgive without once compromising their accusations against the offenders, the uncoupling. They are not moving on in these memoirs, and I would suggest that it's probably impossible to move on. This is indelibly scarred, as Amory and Delvaux reminds us in their memoirs. But there's a tension, there's a dynamic going on in these narratives, where they nonetheless want to establish a different kind of relationship and understanding. Once we reread these testimonies from narratives of recognition, and that's the important moment there, that there is this desire and an expression of recognition, we begin to discover unsuspected dispositions that seek to disrupt survivors from their prisons of despair. We certainly know that one of the significant tropes in survivor memoirs is this feeling of abject loneliness, of abandonment. We know this from the stories that they tell us, right? Where was the world during the Holocaust? That sense of abandonment. But they also write more personally that they feel like the world has given up entirely on their lives. And why is that? Possibly because, as we're told from the 1960s, the world was becoming impatient with all of this talk about the Holocaust. Move on. But it's also, I think, true because if, in fact, survivors in this certainly intentional narrative are declaring war, they have trapped themselves, and they know it, into this idea of giving up on the world themselves. They have withdrawn from this world. They have isolated themselves from this world. They know they're in a position where it's difficult to break out of it, but they're struggling to do so. Or as Amory says, he's struggling to abandon that position. We therefore begin to see, by looking at these narratives of recognition, a desire or a wish to re-engage in their world as broken as it surely was and is for them. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you for an excellent speech. I enjoyed it. One of the things that came to mind during your talk is, have you read the book by Catherine Watterson, Not by the Sword?
No, I haven't.
It's based, can everybody hear me? It's based on a true story about a man who was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. This took place in Lincoln, Nebraska in the late 80s, early 90s. And the cantor and his wife changed his life. It's an incredible story. I read the book and I just couldn't get over it. So he was consumed with hatred and revenge and anger. You know, I could go on and on and on. I've forgotten his name, but anyway, it doesn't matter. It's a based on true story. He's now deceased. But they basically changed his life.
I'm sorry, would you say the name of the book again?
Not by the Sword by Catherine Watterson, I believe it is. I think it's Watterson.
How did they change his life?
They changed his life. They turned his life around, and he went from being this hateful, angry, white supremacist to loving himself and other people.
But is that because of the actions taken by the Klein member or by
The cantor and his wife. The cantor and his wife sort of befriended him, and even though it was difficult, he changed. He did a 360.
So they took the initiative
Basically, yeah.
to restore something in that relationship.
Yes, and he was, you know, you can name it. You know, Jews, blacks, people with disability. He himself had a disability. You know, it's just, I read this stuff and it just gave me the chills to even think anybody could be so consumed with that.
Yes.
And he just, it's an incredible story, so I highly recommend the book.
Well, I appreciate the
Have you
reference.
read it anytime?
No, actually, I haven't checked.
It's wonderful, it's wonderful.
I appreciate the reference because we can, I believe, begin to work with some of the material
Yes.
and apply it to different circumstances. I can see with
So I
that.
was thinking about when you talked about
Good.
Louisville and Carl.
Appreciate
and all
that.
stuff, yeah.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Yes, please.
I'm wondering if you found in any of your research about the villages, and perhaps the one where 1,600 Jews were murdered by their neighbors, if there are any reports of Jews in these communities being able to see some turning point in their neighbors before this happened. Perhaps, you know, the state-sponsored